Hello, welcome to Non-Dual Christianity. In this video, I'd like to talk about God's law and some assumptions we make about that. I think two mistaken assumptions that we have is that one, God has some sort of a universal law or list of rules that have been established, and that we are somehow tested or held accountable to these, and that in some way, violating these does not have its own consequence, so therefore God has to punish people in order to make sure that they follow these laws. Whereas I think when we look at the Bible, what you'll notice is laws are given for different purposes, which I've talked about in my God's Law Purpose video, but for two different contexts. The first being you have a specific time and place and group of people that have a law of how they should interact with one another. So this is culture specific, context specific, and it's why things can change from culture to culture and time to time. Because really the laws are no more binding, no more universal than simply this is how this group is agreeing to interact with one another. The second context would be, since from a non-dual standpoint, everything is unified, right? Everything is the divine nature flowing forth and expressing itself. Then if there are behaviors which go against that underlying unity, then the consequences of those behaviors could be unpleasant, could be harmful. But sometimes the consequences are not easily matched to the behavior, to the violation of the principle. So whereas if you step off of a ledge, you fall, you break your leg, that's sort of an immediate feedback from the law of gravity, and the consequence is inherent to the behavior. If you violate this law of love, the consequences may not be quite so obvious, right? Similar to the consequences of bad diet might not be obvious for a couple of decades. Or if the consequences of violating this law of love, this pattern of love, are you get this unpleasant reaction from other people, you might mistakenly think that they are simply choosing to act a certain way against you and that they are the cause of the consequence, as compared to understanding that your own violation of this pattern is actually creating the response. So the idea here is that violating the pattern has inherent consequences. There's no need for some sort of an additional punishment because of some arbitrary universal law being violated. Two verses I would use to support this idea that there's no universal law is Genesis 1:31. When God completes creation, he calls everything very good. It does not sound like there is evil or there is some part of that that is not God inherent to creation. And the second is 1 Corinthians 6:12, where Paul says, all things are lawful or permissible for me, but not all things are beneficial. Once again, this seems to speak to the absence of some sort of a arbitrary universal code that has to be held to. Rather, everything's permissible. And the violation would either be because my specific group of people in context, I'm breaking a rule, or that I am perhaps violating this underlying pattern of all creation and experiencing the inherent consequences within that. Side note, to some extent, this is why when the Bible talks about God's wrath, it's actually a kindness, because wrath is against sin, right? So briefly in the videos on sin and death, we've talked about how sin creates suffering because there's this perceived sense of separation from God, and in that confusion, we suffer. Suffering being its own punishment, right? Suffering being the violation of this pattern of love and connection. So wrath is an action that moves against that tries to eliminate or drive out that suffering or limit the suffering. So as compared to a form of punishment for breaking some sort of a universal law, it really is a kindness to try to get people to stop suffering, to recognize where they are mistaken and confused and violating this underlying pattern. Because of that, they're suffering. In conclusion, then, what I would like to say is I'd encourage you to do two things. One, to use suffering as an indicator. If you're suffering, that means that you are seeing yourself as separate in some way. You're confused. And the suffering is a feedback mechanism to try to wake you up, to try to help you see that there's something that's out of place. So don't see it as punishment being inflicted from God on the outside in some way. Rather, see it as a sign of a state of confusion where you can cease to suffer if you can recognize what is actually true about you and the reality around you. And the second thing is, don't fear additional punishment from God, because what would be the purpose? Right? If there's nothing that's inherently evil, if there's nothing that's inherently not God, then suffering is its own punishment. There's no need to inflict something additional to that. So the idea that God will punish you even more, it really has no base. And that would be the core of the false assumptions about who God is. It's who we can be as people, absolutely. We can create arbitrary laws and arbitrary punishments. But from the non-dual standpoint, suffering is punishment in and of itself. There's no need for anything more. Thank you for exploring this topic with me today.